So what I have today is really a bunch of questions. And these questions come out of that we don't usually associate to the US, which is Brazil, the place where my passport indicates I'm from. And the questions that I will raise today have to do with two things. One, they have to do with issues of the black presence in modern polities. Can there be black folks fully endowed of rights? And two, what I want to explore is what are the connections that we can make between what happens in Brazil and what happens in the US, and more specifically, what happens in Brazil in times of pre-Soccer World Cup, pre-Olympic Games, and the prison or the school-to-prison pipeline in the US. I know it sounds kind of out there, this dude is crazy, but please bear with me, and I hope that we can draw some of those connections. So I have two theoretical questions that I will then tackle by looking at Rio's case, Rio de Janeiro. So I want to discuss with you what is the logic, what are the principles underlying this idea that black folks constantly live in prisons, whether they are in prisons or not. And this morning, during our little marathon conversation, one of us remembered that Kwame Ture used to repeat the phrase quite often when asked if he was scared of being incarcerated, right? He was about your age. He was organizing. He was calling out white supremacy. He used cracker a lot in his discourses. And reporters would ask him, aren't you afraid of being incarcerated? And he would say over and over again, I was born in prison. So that's what I mean by this logic that makes it so that black folks always already inhabit prisons. The other logic that I want to investigate that's connected to the first one is why is it that within nation states such as the US and Brazil, not only black folks live in prison-like environments, but are constantly subjected to technologies of death. By technologies, I mean not only the weapons and the tactics utilized by the police, but also other softer types of technologies such as schools, such as hospitals, that add to the bodily and physical and spiritual death of black folks. And by investigating these two sides of the logic behind black land as a death-prone black land, I also want to begin to trace those bridges between the US and Brazil. I have a bunch of other theoretical points that I hope we could bring out later on. One of them is how portable the notion of black land is. That is, it seems as if black bodies always carry black land in them. And if black land is the land of death, then the black body becomes the object of these technologies of death. That's something that we can talk about later. So a few starting points. One of them by now is maybe obvious. Rather than thinking about these moments of death as accidental, I want to think about them as foundational, as necessary, as part of the institutions, the cognitions that we support and inhabit. As well, I want to think about the fact that this necro-carceral logic is everywhere. It's not just the prisons, it's universities, it's schools. And of course, I want also I want to be aware of the fact that this logic is not unique and doesn't happen on its own. It's always meshing with and modifying other kinds of logics, such as liberal individualism, racial democracy. In Brazil, that idea of racial democracy is very prevalent, as it is here too, and we can talk about that, and the logic of empire. So the logic of death happens together with these other logics. So back to Rio. I want to look specifically at the police operations that have become part of everyday life in that world city. And I want to figure out what's behind all of these operations. I don't know how many of you have followed some of those stories. Anyone? Do you know what's going on in Rio? Not that many folks. But basically what you have is very frequently, I would say pretty much every week or so, there are these humongous police military operations that unannounced will arrive at a poor neighborhood called favelas, will occupy those neighborhoods, and will engage in military combat with those whom the police think is a suspect or should be wiped out. And of course, all of these operations are going on under the guise of security and development. The whole point here, according to the government's perspective, is to make Rio safe for the World Cup and the Olympic Games, safe for tourism, safe for some of you who may decide to hang out there. So I want to trouble these narratives, and I want to make these narratives be part of a longer duration. I want to insert them into historical narratives, and one of them that's pretty obvious to me is the narrative of slavery. And I want to link some dots between slavery and contemporary forms of statecraft and military operations. Saidiya Hartman, among many others, will call these processes the afterlife of slavery. Slavery is gone, but institutions carry memories that reproduce some of the logics behind slavery. One of the reasons why we know that this may be about the afterlife of slavery is that when you open the newspapers, when you watch television, when you speak with folks in Rio, you are talking about black bodies being killed on a daily basis. And the fact that these killings have become part of your daily life indicate that they have somehow become acceptable, if not necessary, for these policies. So all of this is happening again in specifically black neighborhoods called favelas. When focusing on these black spaces too, the other point that I want you to consider is that we are not dealing with violence per se, but we are dealing with terror. And there's an important distinction here. Violence, all of us in this room more or less understand it as being contingent on us enacting something beyond the codes of good conduct. So you punch somebody, you go over the speed limit, and you don't stop when cops tell you to stop, that in many ways allows for the violence to happen after it. Now, terror is something else, and terror does not come attached with any contract, does not come attached with any understanding of the social order. It's random and it's systematic. So when we put all of these ideas together, what I want to ask is whether these pacifying operations in Rio reproduce constitutive patterns of anti-Black violence. So if the afterlife of slavery is among us, and slavery is constitutive of a nation state, then these police operations may be recycling some of those principles. And of course, the ultimate question is whether these Black bodies can be full members of our modern polities. So in the last 4 years, these police operations have intensified. And what follows these police operations are the so-called police pacification units, which are actual buildings within these neighborhoods that provide assistance to the community members, and that also, formally at least, change the ways in which the local populations relate to the police. So it's a communitarian approach. What is the broader context? The broader context in Brazil is that for the first time ever, the census has somehow caught up with what we all know, which is Brazil is a Black nation. It is also a context where, in spite of being this Black nation, Black folks are still disproportionately represented among the poorest. So higher proportions of Black folks consistently correlate to lower social and economic levels. And this happens to such an extent that many authors have termed these correlations between race and earnings and social space as a Brazilian apartheid. When we plot race by space, what we get are precisely these pockets of land on maps that suggest patterns. So here, what you have are the concentrations of white young people per area. So the darker the area, the higher the concentration of young white youth, and vice versa. And what's interesting is that those areas in the south of Rio and some of the central parts of the city, also the tourist areas where real estate is the most expensive. And one of the reasons why I'm insisting with these maps and these pictures is because to this day, contrary to these data, Brazil is still seen as the land of racial democracy. And that means that race does not determine one's place in society, one's social, economic standing, and therefore should not determine where one lives. Yet when you plot all these data on maps, and when you pay attention to who lives where, the pictures are very different. So this is one of the historic Black neighborhoods that I was talking about. if you're into sports, into tennis, Guga Quayton is a white tennis player that won 3 French tournaments. He visits Mangueira, and the fact that you know exactly who the visitors are and who the locals are will make the point that apartheid may be a good concept by which we can understand Brazil. Yet, Brazil is living through a special moment, perhaps not unlike the moment that we are going through here in the US with a black president. And the special moment is that the last 3 administrations, the federal administration and several state and city administrations in Brazil are by worker party members. And the Workers' Party in Brazil is a socialist organization. And when they emerged out of the labor movement in Brazil in the 80s, they had the agendas of social equality, redistribution of wealth, and the end of the terror against poor communities at the forefront. So it is that special moment because even the black movement recognizes these administrators as interlocutors, as legitimate interlocutors. So the picture is complicated, that's what I'm trying to say. On top of that, if you know anything about Brazil, you know that the last 2 presidents have been extremely popular, with approval rates around 60 and 70%, which is unheard of. And why? Because they have, in fact, been very successful in redistributing wealth. So you go to these poor neighborhoods, they're still poor, but they're much better off than they were, say, 10 years ago. So the Lula administration and the Dilma Rousseff administration have come up with social programs that assist the poor, like family stipends, affirmative action policies are sweeping, and also slow but very palpable change is going on in institutions previously all white, the Supreme Court being one of them. So the Supreme Court chief judge today is a black man, something that would have been as unthinkable as having a black president in the US. So this is the picture that The Economist has used to describe all of these processes, the special moment that came out in 2009. This is Rio, it's the Christ Redeemer that overlooks the city. So what I want to do here is to look at what these police pacifying units have actually accomplished, because it can't be all bad. So the complaint was that these poor communities were controlled by drug dealers who had life and death power over everyone and everything. And one of the things that these pacifying operations have done is they have indeed expelled many of these gangs away from these neighborhoods. So how are these neighborhoods making sense of these campaigns? What improvements have happened? And what actual changes they've brought about? These are some of the pictures of these pacifying police units. They work hard at projecting an image of a communitarian approach. They are often described by the media as very people's friendly. They're constantly helping with your flat tire, with problems in your house, etc. These pacifying units have increased the proportion of police officers per inhabitants considerably, and they have changed their training. So officers these days have training in human rights, in sociology. The former commander of these units had a master's degree in anthropology, so if you don't know what you're doing with your degree later, this is something for you to consider. Yeah, and they pay well, apparently, which is another problem. What's that? Right. So you look into the data produced by the Institute of Public Safety, which is an official organization. Indeed, you can argue that these pacifying police units have produced palpable results. So violent fatalities are down, car thefts are down, street thefts are down. So things are good. And to such an extent that the media, when conducting their own surveys, confirmed that idea. So 70% of those who don't live in pacified communities want those communities, their communities, to be pacified. And folks who live in pacified communities overwhelmingly support those police operations. So there seems to be a very powerful consensus about these police operations, in spite of the deaths, in spite of the shock that they cause in these communities. So all of that stuff is, quite frankly, disturbing. It is disturbing to those of us who are engaged in critical ethnic studies, so to speak, because we are often critical of the state. We are often critical of military operations. And all of a sudden, it seems as if there's wide support for those operations. So Dr. Rodriguez and others, and Dr. Sojourner, we're going to lose our jobs. There's nothing else to criticize, because folks are like, woohoo, yeah, bring it on. So I started looking for finer research that would either put the case to rest or make the conversation more interesting. So this foundation is a very reputable foundation run by economists, social scientists, and they had similar questions. They went to these neighborhoods that experienced pacification and engaged with the folks on the ground. And to make their research even more interesting, they also asked about those pacifying operations among folks who lived in more privileged areas. So one of those areas were neighborhoods in the northern part of Rio. Another area was in the southern part of Rio, but both middle to upper class neighborhoods. And they compared the responses to very basic questions. So you get the research design, you see what these guys are doing? They're asking people what they think about these police operations. Folks from the neighborhoods, that's in red, and folks from more privileged, wider areas. So how much do you know about these police pacifying units? Interestingly, folks who come from wider areas, who are more privileged, know a lot more about these police operations and police pacifying units than the folks who are most impacted by them. So I found that interesting. That may suggest differentiated access to information, to resources, levels of education. Still, there's something to be said about the logic that organizes the program is better known by folks who actually don't have to go through those military operations. More specifically, these researchers asked, how would you evaluate these military operations in those poor and mostly black areas? And Brazilians, I don't think US folks do this as much, but we like to give grades to a lot of things, especially sports competitions. So you open the newspaper on a Monday, every player of every soccer team is graded on a scale from 1 to 10. So that's part of the Brazilian culture. When you evaluate something or somebody, you give that person a grade from 0 to 10. So they asked, inhabitants to grade those police operations according to that scale. And interesting discrepancies come up again. So even though more than half of those who live in poor neighborhoods, the red bars, give high grades to these police operations, folks who don't live there give those police operations even higher grades. Similarly, the rates of disapproval are much higher among folks who live in these poor areas. And this is the last graph I'm going to subject you to. So are you for or against these police operations and these police pacifying units? Similar types of discrepancies. Folks who are outside of those neighborhoods are way more favorable to them than people who go through them. So what do these discrepancies mean? It seems to me that notions of safety and liberty vary depending on who speaks and who speaks from where. There's also a sense that understandings about how the military and the police should function is very precarious across different urban spaces. In other words, tell me where you live and I'll know more or less what you think about these police operations. So this spatial apartheid seems to suggest not only this experiential discrepancy, but also a cognitive discrepancy. Cognitive in the sense of how do you attribute meaning to events that happen around you. And that leads me to ask the next question, which is, who is, oh wow, is it 10 minutes? Oh, 10 minutes, I thought it was 0. Who is represented by the state and its lethal violence? It seems that we can extract from those data that support for the police is also support for violence, support for lethal violence. So while some folks support the violence and therefore support the lethality that this violence generates, others see that violence as a threat to their own being and see that violence rather as terror. So these very different ideas suggest a degree of incommensurability. How do you put these two perceptions of violence together? So of course, once you start your research, you come up with all kinds of interesting data. So the picture is in fact much more complicated than the mass media suggest. Favela residents are actually very wary of these police operations. They mistrust the police, even these new police. They are skeptical that these pacifying units will actually survive past the Olympic Games and the World Cup. And furthermore, they firmly believe that once these mega sport events are over, the drug dealers will come back. It will be business as usual. This is confirmed by ethnographers. Many of our colleagues in Austin do those kinds of work. And what they document are these micro everyday aggressions that these new police officers exercise on local inhabitants. So it is still a police of occupation. It is still a police based on violence and separation rather than integration. So this bibliography, together with ethnographic research, suggests that these pacifying missions are also counterinsurgency strategies. So this is very similar to what the previous presenters were suggesting regarding the new educational zero-tolerance policies in schools, right? Schools as insurgency spaces. So black spaces in Brazil are also insurgency spaces. Yes, these guys deal drugs and these guys commit all kinds of barbaric, messed up acts, but at the same time they provide a bureaucracy and a vision of organization that's explicitly opposed to the state. They telling the state, F you. You don't care about us. You don't belong here. And we are going to run our business the way that we find the most appropriate. So the conflicts that mark places like Rio are about that, are about these favela communities resisting the attempt of the state to control those geographies that have their autonomous economy, drug-based, absolutely, militarized, absolutely, but still autonomous. So it's a threat to the state. But anyway, so what's going on with all these pacification campaigns is that with the new police come new businesses, come real estate speculation. So you go to favelas in Rio today and you guys will pay for a room in one of those neighborhoods more or less the same as you will pay in the traditional tourist areas. So why then are local inhabitants resisting these police operations? One of the reasons why they resist, I think, is because they know that in spite of the new narrative of citizenship and inclusion, what defines the experience of black folks and black youth in particular is their disproportionate vulnerability to death, especially at the hands of the police. So the discrepancies are huge. In every state, the rate of mortality by homicide for black men greatly surpasses that of white men. And homicide by legal intervention, which means homicide by cops, are also way above black folks' populational proportion. So something interesting is going on in Brazil. With this economic boom, homicides for white persons is falling. And homicides of blacks, that includes black and browns, has increased in this same time period. I'm thinking about between 2000 and 2010. The data that I have at the bottom of this slide indicates that this discrepancy is increasing as time goes on. In other words, as time goes on, less white people die and more black people die, so that the distance between those rates of homicide is becoming larger and larger. Isn't that interesting? I find it quite interesting. So these processes have been described as war zones, as evidence of genocide. There are several campaigns that use the term of genocide in Brazil, especially campaigns by black youth. And part of the contradictory moment in Brazil is that the last, as I told you earlier, the last two presidents were part of radical political organization. So they have, as part of their ethical formation, the obligation to listen to and engage with these claims of genocide, which I think would never happen in the US. So that adds another layer of complication to what's happening in Brazil. So the current president is actually endorsing campaigns against the disproportionate killing of young black men based on their own Ministry of Health data. So they know what's going on. But my question remains, so can a state that seems to reproduce the afterlife of slavery be effective in countering these tendencies? You see, I'm recognizing the left-leaning agendas of the federal administration, but I'm also asking you if you think that this left-leaning administration can, in fact, be effective in reversing these processes. And this is what these processes look like. So again, these are daily events. These police operations are increasingly militarized, so the distinction between the police and the military is becoming less and less visible. And the bodies that die are consistently that of young black men. Happening also at a time in which most folks in Brazil will still tell you, poker-faced, that race does not exist. This is the country of racial democracy. And this is a magazine that's equivalent of the Time magazine. It came out in 2007, making precisely that point, that the government is crazy in instituting affirmative action policies because race doesn't exist. And the case that they use here is that of two identical twins who applied for a university, and in Brazil to apply for quotas, you have to go through an interview, and after the interview, one of them was categorized as black, the other one was categorized as white. And so according to this magazine, that was proof that race did not exist. So I want to close with this. I want to think of those spaces, again, as spaces that are not only in Brazil, but are part of the broader black diaspora. And so when we consider the diaspora, what we need to do is seek relations rather than comparisons. So what does it mean, for example, that one of the first measures taken by the officials in Rio that are in charge of organizing the Olympic Games was to hire Rudolph Giuliani as security advisor? What does that mean? Is that by accident? There's no such thing as an accident. So just remember that it was during Giuliani that the stop and frisk stuff that we discuss now was actually first implemented very systematically and much more violently. And the cases of Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo are there to remind us. Another thing to consider, most of those soldiers, military personnel that now occupy Brazilian favelas are veterans coming fresh out of Haiti. What were those guys doing in Haiti? They were part of the United Nations equivalent of a pacifying mission. And if you read up about those campaigns, you see a body count that's very similar. So those military interventions involved those surprise strikes, and they usually produce between 20 and 30 deaths each. Same approach in Haiti. So I think I'll stop here. I have a bunch of other slides, but I'm more interested in the discussion. Yeah, so thanks for your patience.